And my guest, we are joined by the man himself. And I am so glad that he hit me up, Jeff Rich. Jeff Rich is an author, historian, podcaster who's worked 33 years in government. You've been behind the curtain, my friend. You see how the machinery works. Now retired, he currently lives in Melbourne, Australia. Jeff has spent a lifetime of studying history and how knowledge of historical currents can help give context to our changing world. You can find Jeff on YouTube at The Burning Archive, and you can find him on the Substack at jeffrichsubstack.com. Jeff, thank you for joining me, man, especially this late at night. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, Jamal. It's a real pleasure. I really love watching your show, and it's wonderful to be a guest talking to you.
Oh, I am very happy. I've noticed your videos beforehand, so when you hit me up, I couldn't connect initially the person to the channel. And when I looked at the Burning Archive, I was like, oh, I know this place. I've been to this place. So that's even better. No, thank you for joining me, especially with your historical context. I love historical context because I think it's fascinating. Because, what ends up happening is that as human beings, we are brought up into our own era. And if you don't know what happened in previous eras, the logic that went on in the previous era could still be working in the current era. And you could be replicating something that you don't realize you're replicating and just go through your era with that kind of blinders on about historical context. This is why I love talking to historians about this stuff. The thing I brought up to you, and I'm glad you found it receptive, that was a Russian, I don't know who he was, a diplomat, part of the government. And he made this argument that the Soviet Union's collapse was illegal, like meaning it didn't happen under legal terms. And because it didn't happen under legal terms, then Ukraine is technically an internal matter. And as I pointed out to the audience, that's a hell of a can of worms to open, because if that's true, there are a lot of other states that were part of the Soviet Union. Give me a take first on that before we step into it.
Well, I think it was a man called Anton, let me just double check his name, I have it right here, Kobyakov. And yeah, he's an official in the Russian government. And the argument is that when the Soviet Union dissolved in late 1991, it wasn't done by the book, so to speak. And there is a pretty plausible claim to say that is correct. And therefore, the Soviet Union continues to exist. And I guess by implication in the current moment, that the current Ukrainian state has another sort of black mark of illegitimacy on it, as well as all the other sort of things that we have all discussed with the nationalism and all that kind of stuff, elections, conscription, all those kinds of things. So it really goes back to the very disorderly way in which the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, which you could actually say is really, in some respects, one of the root causes of this conflict, in Ukraine, so it's perhaps not entirely surprising that this issue be raised again. It's been raised over many years by various people. It's not like a new argument, it's a pretty well-established argument. And even at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev said, this is not correct procedure. So it is a well-established sort of argument. But I guess raising it in the current moment, goes back to the whole question of, well, what are the legitimate borders of Ukraine? What's the right establishment of a state for Ukraine?
Yeah, but that's kind of treacherous to raise it now, right? I mean, and the reason why I say that is, it's one thing if you say, this war is being launched because NATO is on our border. You've overthrown the Ukrainian state. You have a heavy military presence on our border. You are killing ethnic Russian Ukrainians. Like, you could make an argument of provocation for that. When Russia says, look, we're not trying to invade anywhere else. We're dealing with this because this is a security matter on our border. Okay, again, that makes sense. The U.S. and the Cuban Missile Crisis is a really good example. And how would the U.S. react if Russia knocked over Canada, or Russia knocked over Mexico, and started putting in, goons, raising a military? We would act in similar ways. The moment that you say countries like Estonia, Latvia, because if you say Ukraine is internal, then all of those countries are internal, right? Or am I wrong? Am I missing something in this?
Look, I think that's right. I mean, there's the legal argument, I guess, and then there's the factual circumstances. Like no one's really going to reverse the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. I think Vladimir Putin at one point said that anyone with a heart wouldn't regret the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but no one with a brain would want to put it back together again.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the case. But there's a wonderful book about the dissolution of the Soviet Union by Vladislav Zubok, Collapse, and it's a great. I mean, he's worked in America and Britain for decades, but originally he grew up in the Soviet Union and was, if you like, a witness of those events. And in that book, he actually he's gone through the archives and all that sort of stuff. And there's a moment in late 1991 when Mikhail Gorbachev is on the phone to George Bush and says, if you recognise Ukraine as an independent state, you're sowing the seeds for a future conflict between Russia and Ukraine that will be worse than the breakup of Yugoslavia. And, here we are, whatever it is, I don't know.
And he could see that far.
34 years later.
Yeah, that's what I mean. He could see that far. And the book I read on the collapse had to do with Yeltsin and Gorbachev and this kind of changing political fates of the two. It didn't go into archival stuff. It was more so how this flip in power between these people over the course of a year, which was, again, fascinating in itself. But they could see that far into the future saying, look, this is going to be a problem. Is it because Gorbachev assumed that the whole 1 inch to the east stuff was bogus?
Well, he may well have had suspicions, but all the issues that are in play today were actively being discussed then. And even Yeltsin, who was really a key player in the dissolution of the Soviet, in the secession of Russia, which, just going back to the legal officials, argument about dissolution of the Soviet Union, it's actually the Russian Federation was, sorry, I've got a little mosquito in front of my face there. The Russian Federation, rather than Ukraine, was, if you like, the prime culprit in the dodgy dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Of course, yes.
Yeltsin pushing things, and we can go into the details of the process, but and it was his rivalry with Gorbachev which was also driving that to some extent, and that conflict between Yeltsin and Gorbachev was really fundamental to the cause of the problem. Even though people often think these days that the collapse of the Soviet Union was inevitable, it was really a very chaotic period in which lots of things could have happened, and as suggested by that call from Gorbachev in late 1991 to the White House, could easily have been prevented. In fact, this historian really argues that if Gorbachev and Yeltsin had sort of come to terms a little bit more successfully, then that the secession of Ukraine and Russia could have been avoided, and there would have been some kind of more union sort of state continuing. So, really fundamental thing. And in the end, America also plays a role in all of this as well. And some of all the arguments about eastward expansion, etc., were already there. There were people like James Baker who made the verbal promise not to move NATO 1 inch forward, the Secretary of State under George Bush Senior. He was really advocating, I guess, support for Gorbachev, if you like, in terms of keeping the Soviet Union together and organising some kind of peaceful transition. But on the other hand, there were the hawks in the the real anti-Russia, anti-Soviet types in the White House who were keen to sort of really, if you like, kick the Soviet Union when it was down and make sure that it could never ever get back up again. So, and one of those people was our old friend from the Iraq War, Dick Cheney.
Yeah.
So he has his fingerprints over this as well. So even at that moment of or in the year or so prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was, I guess, division within the American government.
Yeah,
There
there
was
always is.
domestic lobbying from the Ukrainians in America, and there was also a kind of let's say, bad faith negotiation, at least from
Yeah.
some parts of the Americans.
I'm curious of something, though. Let's assume for the moment that Russia accepted, okay, they aren't being serious with this 1 inch to the
Yeah.
east stuff. It sounds nice. But we don't believe that they're going to honor it. Could they have done anything about it anyway? Like, meaning, if, like, for example, right now, you have Donald
Yeah.
Trump pretending to be a mediator while being part of the conflict directly involved. And whether it's 100,000 or 200,000 Russians that have been killed, the US, even by our own papers, point out that we were directly involved in targeting weapons supply. The CIA was there for decades. And then you get Trump saying, hey, I'm not part of this. Let's mediate. And the deal that he's putting on the table is ludicrous. Like, Putin knows that Trump is BSing and full of it. If Gorbachev knew it at the time, could he have done anything about it? Or was he stuck with just the promise?
Yeah, it's difficult, and that's, I mean, it's part of the tragedy of the story of Gorbachev that he was a visionary in many ways. He introduced these major reforms, but in a way, he also unleashed more than he could handle,
Yeah.
and he sort of. There was and for Yeltsin too, there were people sort of wanted to be like America. So America was perhaps at its maximum point of soft power. So even though they were also a bit suspicious of their intentions, and Gorbachev pleaded with the US to support, have like a Marshall Plan, if you like, a sort of economic reconstruction package
He wouldn't
for
do it.
the Soviet Union to organise a transition. And there was meetings of the G7 or whatever number of great powers they were at that point, and effectively partly for the kind of reasons I talked about before, with Dick Cheney wanting to kick the Soviet Union so far down into the hole that it will never ever get back up again. They kind of refused to offer that package, and
Right.
Gorbachev felt betrayed, and I think the figure was something like $100 billion, and I don't know, how that would sort of index in current dollar terms, but let's say it's $500 billion. Okay, can you imagine what the comparative opportunity cost of spending $500 billion to have peace with the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
peace in Europe? And a lot of avoided wars over the last few decades. Imagine what that. I mean, how much has the US spent already just in this conflict in Ukraine? It's truly astonishing. So, I think there was definitely a sense in which it was a missed opportunity, both in terms of poor leadership, or perhaps not quite naive, but overly trusting, overly dependent, perhaps, leadership, foreign policy leadership by Gorbachev in the late 80s, early 90s, but also a failure of vision from the United States. I mean, if perhaps they had gone more with James Baker and George Bush's Senior's better instincts, we could have gone an entirely different path. And it was enormously consequential because, of course, Russia and all the post-Soviet states, including Ukraine, really had, a wretched next 10 to 20 years, horrible, horrible economic and social collapse. In a way, China was also a beneficiary of all that because, all that American investment that could have gone into the Soviet Union, if you like, went into China. And the world developed in a very different and distorted way.
But Jeff, that assumes the peace is the objective. And I don't think it is.
Yeah.
It's just
Well, no, that's right. That's right. That's right. And I think that's also part of the issue at the moment. I mean, I think that's why people have got very confused with Trump and, Trump the peacemaker and all that sort of stuff. I don't think really he's ever, I don't think he doesn't have a vision of peace that he's working towards. What he has is a set of objectives about ending the war and getting, what he wants out of the end of the war. So, I mean, in a way, all he's done is just redefine US war aims to, come back with some rare earths from Ukraine and, minimise his future exposure and sort of redirect some of his military resources towards China. He doesn't have a vision of saying, well, Russia and the European Union and Ukraine are all neighbours and all economically connected, culturally connected in many complex ways. How are they going to live in peace together? And how are we going to facilitate that happening? He's really just approached, I think, the peace process in a very mercenary and ineffective way.
Yeah, I think he's approaching like an American president. I mean, all things being equal, I think he's approaching it like an American president. And I know that sounds horrible, but like Trump has said two things that I don't think he's fully internally connected to yet. One, it's proxy war. Okay, that means our hands are all over it. And two, in a couple of years, Ukraine is going to be part of Russia, meaning Russia is going to effectively take Ukraine. Okay, so that means you lost the war. It's your war. You've owned it as your war, and you've lost that war. And yet he's dictating terms as if that's not true. And, Mark has always brought up this question of, can an American president accept what Russia would demand in order to make peace? And the answer seems to be no. I mean, Vance is saying, well, Russia's demands are too much. Okay, they're demanding that you stop giving them intelligence and weapons if you want a ceasefire. Like the notion that you call for a ceasefire and then you build up Ukraine full of weapons, military, more intelligence. You allow them to raise another military. You put in European troops. This stuff is nonsense. Like it's a non-starter on its face. And either he's not bright enough to know that, either he's being led by people who don't want peace, which I suspect is true. But he doesn't seem to connect with the fact that you've lost. That seems to be the overwhelming thing to me. And it seems that this would have to keep going until it is so brimmingly clear that they lost, that no deal can be made until then. Give me a take on that. Like, how do you even make a lasting peace in Europe after this, considering these people don't seem to want peace, or the people in power don't anyway?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think in some ways, I think it's good to think about all the different parties involved. So there's Russia, there's Ukraine, obviously, there's the United States, but Europe also, the European Union, just to sort of gather together France, Germany, and all those people. But also, I think Britain is also a separate player as well. And I think, at some point, there's going to have to be a recognition by the United States and the European Union that they have failed to achieve their objectives. And I think that will probably be provoked by a military crisis and a governance crisis in Ukraine, ultimately. I think that is what will... And in some senses, I almost felt that part of Trump's rush to sort of end the war quickly was, decided to get out before it got too bad, sort of thing. Get me away from this crime scene. And,
Right.
someone remove the fingerprints straight away.
Get away from this
And by
crime
the way,
scene. Oh, I
just
love
give
that.
that bag of money to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right, but
But
please.
I just saw a little bit of the footage you were talking about of the recent bombing of the Patriots, the pace of advance of the Russian
Yeah.
forces
Sunni
is gathering,
Caspiar. Yeah.
and the strains in Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian state, are very acute. I mean, the conscription, the nationalism, all that sort of thing. I feel there will come a moment when reality will be forced upon the United States and Europe as well, and they'll just be forced by a situation to deal with it in a different way. Now,
What is that?
as you
What
say,
is that
there is a
mean?
tendency from the US just to say, it doesn't matter how badly we lose a war, we are never defeated.
Right.
And I think I just think in the new distribution of power around the world, that kind of position is simply no longer viable, because everyone can see, yes, you have been defeated in Ukraine, and yes, you have lost a tariff war with China. That the sustainability of the kind of American primacy, American supremacy sort of positioning around the world is it's collapsing. I think it's really collapsing, and in a way, the authority of the United States is not in the control of the United States; it's in the control of all the other countries around the world. So things are sort of shifting beneath the surface, and I think we'll come to a crisis point driven by military situation that will force the hand for some kind of renegotiation. Now it's going to be difficult given the grandiose positioning of Trump, and also the very strong positioning of the European Union. But I think they'll be forced with. My big concern is there'll be, a kind of a social catastrophe at some point in Ukraine. There's already been millions of refugees from Ukraine.
Right.
If the Ukrainian state collapses under military pressure, what's going to happen then? The authority, the sort of, will people be wanting to flee into Europe? Will people want to get out of Ukraine as fast as they can? How well disposed will the countries of Europe be about that? We know the United States won't be taking anybody, and there'll be a lot of water under the bridge, if we can put it in a sort of euphemistic term, that society will have to come to terms with. It's been bitterly divided by some pretty toxic ideas over the last few years.
Oh, that's an understatement.
So that's the big thing I guess I worry about, because often the ends of war, and if you like, if you think about the collapse of the Soviet Union, it wasn't a war. It was the end of the Cold War, but it wasn't as catastrophic as having the city bombed. But that was a complete social catastrophe for Russia in the post. So, life expectancy fell, there was like the poverty rate more than doubled. It was, people celebrate the birth of freedom in the Soviet Union in the West, but they just ignore the pain and the suffering that sort of caused. And I guess I fear that we could be in a similar situation in Ukraine. Ukraine, and also in Europe, Poland, refugees across the border, they'll go into Hungary, they'll, all that sort of thing. And, those societies are already a bit resistant to those refugee flows. So you could get some very nasty situations indeed. And that's why I really think it's important for, even though the European Union's been pretty stroppy, as people say in Australia, pretty obstreperous about negotiating with Russia.
What's that? Obstreperous.
In the end, if there's a humanitarian catastrophe on the borders of, Russia and Europe, that's Russia and Europe's social problem to solve. It's got nothing to do with the United States. The United States, wrecked the place, but the United States is not going to help fix that problem at all, I would imagine, certainly not under the current
Just to be clear, though, you believe
policies.
that it may take a military catastrophe in order to create the social pressure necessary for, because one of the other issues that Russia has, what time is it?
Yeah.
Okay, we have a few minutes. One of the other issues that Russia has, and I think the world has in general, dealing with Ukraine, and I know that Donald Trump has, if indeed he has any instinct for trying to bring it to so close, is the government that's in Kiev. They've gotten rid of opposition parties. They've gotten rid of opposition media. They've murdered opposition candidates. They put opposition candidates in jail. I have a good friend of the show that comes on who is living in Switzerland, I believe, because he'd be murdered if he was in Ukraine. Aristovich, he's living abroad because, again, he would get murdered. There was a recent murder on, I forget where it was, in Spain or somewhere, of a Ukrainian diplomat or dissident who was outside of the country for fear of his life. And of course, Ukrainian media celebrated the murder and assassination of that opposition figure. So it's like, how do you get political change in a government that is just a dictatorship by any stretch of the imagination at this point?
Yeah. Well, I just can't see how you can unless, I guess there's two ways. One, the military collapse type situation. And I mean, I'm no military analyst, so I can't really tell, but it does seem, getting close. And then the other, I guess, would be some sort of internal coup, some sort of action by the military to replace the leader. Will probably come, I guess, from the military, because the parties have been abolished. People are terrified. The intelligence agencies are, highly, so you can't expect demonstrations on the street to sort of change the situation. So it would likely be an act of desperation of survival of the state by military in some way.
Wow.
And, the ideology of some of the people running the regime in Ukraine are I guess the worry would be they want to go down in a blaze of nationalist glory.
Wow. Jeff, man, I have enjoyed this. I have to bring you back because I want to get into some of the other items. Like Gorbachev is a really good example. I am fascinated by him because Carl, will into you in one moment. I am of the Russians that I've met hate him. The Americans that I've met love him. I'm one of those Americans that love him because I think we need visionaries and we need people who are willing to extend a hand, even when the hands get bitten, to be able to still do it. Because otherwise, we just have a world of sociopaths. Jeff, man, got to bring you back. Jeff, thank you for this, man. I hope this wasn't, I know this is late for you. I'm sorry that this is so late in the evening.
It's totally fine. Jamal, it's really wonderful to talk to you. And it'd be lovely to talk to you about Gorbachev again sometime.
Excellent. And just other items associated with the war in general, historical context. I'd love to have you back.
Absolutely.
Jeff Rich, he's an author, historian, podcaster who has worked 33 years in government. He is now retired. He currently lives in Melbourne, Australia. Jeff has spent a lifetime studying history and his knowledge of historical currents. Oh, and how knowledge of historical occurrences can give a context to a changing world and political environment. You can find Jeff on YouTube at The Burning Archive. You can also find him on Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. Jeff, thank you, man. I really appreciate this. We had a great audience here also for you. So this is great.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Have a good one. Be safe. All right.